in talk radio. Of, for, and by you, the people.
Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Hi, I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for talk radio news stations, KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, Democrats, and labor unions. BannonPR.com is the sponsor of today's show. If you want to know more about me and my political polling company, or if you have any ideas or suggestions for Deadline DC, the best way to reach me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle, all one word, is Brad Bannon. Today, in the first half hour, our guest is national security expert Cedric Leighton, who will discuss the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan and other foreign policy issues. Then in the second half hour, Edwith Theogene of Generation Progress and our own Mark Grimaldi join me on the provocative progressive political panel to talk about the big political news of the week. But first, let's listen to President Biden talk about his announced withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan.
How many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons were you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome. The United States cannot afford to remain tethered to policies created in response to a world as it was 20 years ago. We need to meet the threats where they are today. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized beyond Afghanistan. So, we are repositioning our resources and adapting our counterterrorism posture to meet the threats where they are now, significantly higher in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. But make no mistake, our military and intelligence leaders are confident they have the capabilities to protect the homeland and our interests from any resurgent terrorist challenge emerging or emanating from Afghanistan.
That, of course, was President Biden talking about the withdrawal of troops from U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Our guest in this segment is national security expert Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired. He is the founder and president of Cedric Leighton Associates, a strategic risk and leadership consultancy serving global companies and organizations. He founded the company after serving in the U.S. Air Force for 26 years as an intelligence officer, attaining the rank of colonel. His Twitter handle is at Cedric Leighton, CedricLeighton, and his website is cedricleighton.com. Colonel Leighton, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. We always appreciate you being on the show. I always think we have some very interesting conversations. Let's start with Afghanistan. It seems to me that President Biden made a very difficult decision that, however painful it is, somebody finally needed to make after 20 years. Not with U.S. troops withdrawing from Afghanistan, it seems to me it's the right thing to do. We'd been tied up there for a couple of decades now, and it seemed to me we hadn't made any progress in bolstering the Kabul government. What's your take on the president's decision?
Well, Brad, thanks again for having me here. It's always a pleasure. The thing with President Biden's decision on Afghanistan, Brad, is that I agree with you that it was the right thing to do. Now, the question then becomes, one of execution. How do you go about doing this without losing some of the gains that we did achieve in Afghanistan, some of which the president alluded to, such as keeping the homeland safe from terrorist attacks emanating in Afghanistan, other things such as women's rights, the rights of girls to go to school, things like that are going to be a lot harder to keep once the U.S. troop presence goes down to zero. We're basically almost there. We have about 650 troops still left in and around Kabul, basically to protect the embassy and the airport there. So with us leaving Afghanistan, a lot of those intangible things that we have somewhat gotten used to are probably going to go away as far as Afghan society is concerned and the Afghan military landscape. But the problem is one that the president addressed, I think, directly, and that is the way that we did this, the types of tactics and strategies that we employed in Afghanistan were ones that would not really change the inevitable outcome. And that inevitable outcome is that the government in Afghanistan is going to have a very difficult time maintaining its hold on power. And it's also, at least appears at the moment, to be inevitable that the Taliban are going to take over at least large portions of the country. They already have done that, at least nominally. And if they continue to do that, then it's going to be a very difficult thing for that government to hold on.
If you listen closely to the clip we played from the president, he basically makes the case that we can still protect the United States from terrorism, but as you said, the withdrawal really doesn't, help the situation in Afghanistan at all. As you say, what do you think you think, and I think many experts agree that once the American troops are completely out of Afghanistan, the Taliban will eventually take over the country. And what do you think that's going to mean? It probably means bad things for the people of Afghanistan. You mentioned the fact, the rights of women and, young women being able to receive an education. Do you think Afghanistan will become a terrorist threat again?
Well, it's certainly possible. I think it's going to be a bit more difficult for groups in Afghanistan who are using Afghanistan as a base to launch out of Afghanistan. We know kind of what to look for there, even if we're not directly on the ground there. But I also think that, given that fact, it's going to be one of those areas where we have to be very careful that we don't lose sight of what's actually going on there. And without, having people on the ground there, at least a number of people on the ground from an intelligence collection perspective, it might be more difficult to be able to ascertain intentions of groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and especially the ISIS Khorasan group, which is the one that's primarily in Afghanistan. If they intend to attack the United States, we might not have as much early warning as we would have had if we were still there. But we have to make a decision. Do we go ahead and move to other areas that are important for us from a national security standpoint, or do we continue to stay in a place where it becomes questionable whether or not there's going to be a threat emanating from there, at least as far as our homeland is concerned? So that's the big dilemma from that standpoint.
Okay. Our guest in this half hour is Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired, national security expert who was an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force for 26 years. We're going to go to break now, so for our radio audience, but we are going to stay here for our TV audience, so don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC and Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired, when we get back from these messages. Talk more about American national security and other foreign policy issues. So we'll be back right after this message.
I want to get back to seeing my grandbabies every Sunday.
Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guest in this half hour is national security expert Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired. In the previous segment, we were talking about the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. I want to ask you one more question about Afghanistan before we move on. And my question is, obviously, this did not work out very well for the United States or for the people of Afghanistan. What lessons can we learn from the future about the conduct of American foreign policy from the Afghanistan situation, Colonel Leighton?
Well, Brad, I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned here, but foremost among these is if you go in to a place like Afghanistan, know its history and understand that there's a reason that place is called the graveyard of empires. We don't want to be part of that graveyard. And one of the key things in this particular case is to have a mission end state a desired end state that you want to get to. And once you achieve that end state, then it's time for us to leave. In my view, the end state could have been the elimination of bin Laden from the battlefield. Once that happened, that would have been a good time to declare an end to the conflict, at least from our perspective, and move on to other things. Obviously, we didn't do that, but that would be one example of how I see us moving forward in a case like this and perhaps taking some lessons learned from the Afghan experience.
Okay, let's switch topics now. Last week, the leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, traveled to D.C. to meet with President Biden. It seemed to be a cordial meeting and an opportunity for President Biden to restore our somewhat frayed ties with our NATO alliances. It seemed like a cordial meeting between the two leaders, much more cordial than the meetings that I remember between President Trump and Merkel. What does the Merkel visit say about Joe Biden's foreign policy in the first 6 months of his presidency?
Brad, I think it really shows that Joe Biden wants to return to what I would call a normal U.S. foreign policy. And by that, I mean one in which our alliance partners are honored for their status as partners, where they're not ridiculed even if they have different points of view, like Germany does when it comes to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, just as an example of that. It becomes a really important element when you look at the different relationships that we have to be strong against our adversaries, but accepting of our friends. And I think this visit was one in which Joe Biden showed a somewhat traditional view of American foreign policy, and I think the German side welcomed that.
Okay. We're going to go take another break so we can bring back our radio listeners. We'll be back with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon and with Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired. And we will switch and.
For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, and follow us on the Twitters at laborhistoryin2.
Okay, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Welcome back to our radio listeners. And a reminder to our radio listeners that if you'd like to see Deadline DC as well as listen to it, you can watch us on Periscope TV at periscope.tv/Brad Bannon. You can also see us on Facebook Live and on YouTube. Our guest in this half hour is Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired, who is here to talk about foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States and the world. Colonel Leighton, last week there were reports from a new book by, I believe, 2 Washington Post reporters about the reaction of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, General Milley, to the Capitol insurrection and other hints that President Trump was not going to go quietly from the White House without fighting with his every last breath. And the reality is he's still telling people he's the duly elected president of the United States. But General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, found these events very troubling. Why don't you talk about that, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, Brad, the chairman of chiefs is actually by law the #1 ranking military officer in the United States. So when somebody like General Milley is chairman of the Joint Chiefs has reservations or concerns about the president of the United States, it has to be taken extremely seriously. And what these concerns were basically boiled down to this. General Milley thought that when he saw Trump's actions, Trump's rhetoric, and the desire that President Trump had to maintain his position as president of the United States in spite of the election results, General Milley saw overtones of the 1930s and specifically the 1930s in Germany. And what he was referring to specifically there was the way in which Adolf Hitler took over power in 1933. So General Milley, who's a student of history, took a look at this, saw what Trump wanted to do by involving the military in areas like putting down the Black Lives Matter protesters and other protests that were going through the country over the summer of 2020. He saw that as being a very dangerous thing because the military does not get involved, the U.S. military does not get involved in domestic disturbances. And what we could have experienced here would have been the military getting involved and possibly shooting at or trying to apprehend Americans who were engaged in peaceful protests. That was unacceptable to General Milley, and it's unacceptable to anybody who has served in the military, studied the Constitution, and who knows what the limits of American military power are. We are not a domestic law enforcement entity. And the military is also not an organization that is designed to repress the American people. It is instead a microcosm of America that is designed to protect American society from external enemies and external adversaries. These adversaries that President Trump talked about definitely did not fit that criterion. And so when you look at those things, and then you look at the way in which the events that led up to the January 6th insurrection unfolded, the big area here was that General Milley sought to keep the U.S. military out of the political situation. But he also knew that he had to make sure that the transition from President Trump to President Biden was a protected transition, that it could actually happen on January 20th with the inauguration. So the things that General Milley did led up to what came about as a somewhat peaceful transition on the 20th of January. Certainly we all went through January 6th, which, as we all know, was not peaceful. But I think that woke up a lot of people in the military to the potential dangers of a coup instituted by the then sitting president of the United States.
Yeah, I found this story about General Milley significant for a couple of reasons. One is if you read history, anytime you see the military concerned about a government, it's usually involved in pushing the coup against the established government. And here you have a situation where our top military leader, General Milley, was concerned that one would happen and was determined not to get the military involved in it. The other thing I thought about, it struck me, was the general do direct comparisons between his concerns about President Trump's behavior and the Nazi takeover in Germany in 1932, I guess it was. And I guess it's reassuring to know that the top military leadership in this country was so concerned about upholding the democratic process instead of letting it fall into a fascist-like coup. So I guess this is good news in a way.
It absolutely is. And it shows the viability of not only some of our institutions, especially the military in this case, but also the people who make it up. And in this case, General Milley being the top officer in the U.S. military, he performed exactly the way he needed to in order to protect our Constitution.
Okay. One last topic before we close. I'd like to ask you, what is going on in Cuba there? There are anti-government protests. People who are, who are unhappy about economic conditions have been protesting the communist government. What exactly is happening there?
Well, I think this is one of the big things, Brad, where you see the failure of a government to handle the COVID-19 pandemic playing out in the streets. There have been other instances around the world where people have gone into the streets. In Cuba, this is particularly noteworthy because these protests have never happened on this scale before. And what they show is the vision of the Cuban people tends to be more of a democratic, more of a almost, we couldn't say libertarian, but definitely a more democratic vision of the future of the country, which is, of course, at odds with the Communist Party dictatorship that exists there right now. But when the people are chanting liberty in the streets of Havana, what we're seeing is a reaction of trying to repress that movement, but it also looks as if there's a lot of support here in the United States for that effort, and I think we may see potentially some changes in Cuba as a result of that.
Okay, Colonel Leighton, thanks very much for joining us today. Always love to have you on. And I always feel that national security policy is the unwanted stepchild of American policymaking. We talk all the time about domestic matters, but don't talk enough about national security issues, which is why I'd like to bring you aboard. Thanks for joining us. That's all for this half hour of Deadline DC. But we'll be back after this break with the provocative progressive political panel. With Edwith Theogene of Generation Progress and our own executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. We'll be right back after this message.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
Right now, our country feels divided, but there's a place where people are coming together.
I gotta tell you, I was nervous to talk to someone so different than me.
Me too, but I'm glad we are.
Love Has No Labels and One Small Step are helping people with different political views, beliefs, and life experiences come together through conversation, and it feels good.
Wow, your story is so...
Interesting?
Yeah.
When people actually sit down, talk, and listen to one another, they can break down boundaries and connect as human beings. At lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep, you can listen to amazing, life-changing conversations and find simple tools to start a conversation of your own.
I know one thing. This conversation gives me hope.
It gives me a lot of hope, too.
Take a step toward bringing our country and your community together by having the courage to start a conversation at lovehasnolabels.com/onesmallstep. A message from StoryCorps, Love Has No Labels, and the Ad Council.
It's time for America to go back to the future. The future of true greatness created by people united to build a strong nation for the common good. From the start of our United States, Americans have backed leaders who dared to do big public projects. Jefferson, Lincoln, TR, FDR, Truman, Ike, JFK, and LBJ all dared to achieve bold goals. It's only since Ronald Reagan's government is evil demagoguery that our presidents and lawmakers shrivel to no-can-do mediocrities, unwilling even to try tackling America's big needs or invest in our people's unlimited possibilities. Their failure is why our nation's infrastructure, once world-class, has deteriorated to an embarrassing 16th in the world. It's hard to muster any national pride in chanting, "We're number 16." But surprise, here comes Joe, a lifelong go-slow Democrat, unexpectedly proposing a get-serious, roll-up-our-sleeves $2 trillion package of investments to modernize and extend America's collapsing infrastructure. In addition to roads, bridges, and dams, it gives a long-overdue boost to such needs as rural high-speed broadband and providing affordable child care facilities, all geared to creating good union jobs and lifting local economies. Even more transformative is Biden's Back to the Future method of paying for this Rebuild America agenda by returning to progressive taxation. Instead of the same old no-tax, laissez-faire extremism that Washington has practiced for 40 years, Biden will at long last demand that multinational corporate behemoths stop dodging their tax obligations to America. It's the same fair tax policy that funded our nation's real needs in the past, while also increasing productivity and raising living standards for millions of working families. This is Jim Hightower saying, let's do it again.
Welcome back, Headline DC with Brad Bannon. We, as usual, are going to have our provocative progressive political panel. But before we do that, we're going to play this clip from Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts about the need to deal with the problem of student loan debt.
The consequence of student loan debt means there are lots of people who aren't moving out from their parents' homes, lots of people who aren't buying their own homes, and one of the other things the data shows, lots of people who are not starting their own businesses. And all of those things hold back our economy. And I make that point because I'm sure there are lots of folks who are on this call tonight who don't have student loan debt. But here's the deal. Even if you don't have student loan debt, you will be helped by seeing student loan debt canceled because it will help our economy. This is one of those things that doesn't have to go through Congress. The authority is already there in law for the president and his team, the administration, the Secretary of Education, to cancel out this student loan debt. And President Obama used it to cancel some student loan debt. President Trump used it to cancel some student loan debt. I want to see President Biden use it. If he would cancel $50,000 in student loan debt, it would make an enormous difference in the lives of tens of millions of Americans and help build our entire nation a stronger future going forward. So, as you know, I'm all in on this one. And if we could persuade the president, we could do this one fast.
Okay, that was Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. This is Deadline DC with Brad Bannon, who hails from Massachusetts. So I'm very proud to have Senator Warren as my home state senator, along with Senator Markey, who's also a great progressive. This half hour of Deadline DC is brought to you by my company, Bannon Communications Research, which polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. An analysis of Joe Biden's 2020 election victory portrays the opportunities that await the Democratic Party and the obstacles that confront the GOP down the line. The most encouraging sign for Democrats in 2020 was the generational changing of the guard. The 2020 election was a watershed moment in generational politics in American political history. For the first time in a presidential election, members of the silent generation, born between 1928 and 1945, and baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, cast fewer ballots than the younger group. That includes millennials who were born between 1981 and 2002, and people in Generation X from 1965 to 1980. The rising power of millennials illustrates the importance of dealing with problems caused by devastation of climate change and the overwhelming student loan debt. You can read the rest of this column and all my columns in The Hill at muckrack.com/Brad-Bannon. Now it's time for the provocative progressive political panel. Our guest panelist today is Edwith Theogene, Advocacy Director for Generation Progress. Edwith is the Generation Progress is the youth engagement arm of the Center for American Progress. In this role, Edwith works to develop and lead efforts to translate the experiences of young adults into concrete actions that advance progressive policies and increase voter turnout. Joining Edwith on the panel is progressive political activist Mark Grimaldi. Mark has worked in several Democratic presidential campaigns, including the campaign of Joe Biden. Mark is also active in campaign finance reform and efforts to promote cancer research. His Twitter handle is Mark J. Grimaldi. That's MarkJGrimaldi. Welcome, panel. Thanks for being together with me on Deadline DC today. Edwith, since I mentioned it, and it's the subject of my latest column in The Hill, why don't you talk about the importance of millennials and Generation X to the progressive movement?
Yeah, I mean, so Generation Progress, we actually represent millennials, and we also represent Gen Z. So I am what folks would call an elder millennial or Gen Y or like a geriatric millennial. But 1984 is part of the group that sort of started this new generation. And what's really exciting about this recent election is that young people voted in such historic numbers. There was an 11-point increase in the turnout of young people in the 2020 election. And this is the most that young people have voted in any election since the voting age was lowered about 50 years ago to 18. So young people really showed out in a particular time during the pandemic. We turned out as poll workers, we turned out as people to register and get people out to vote. We also were huge advocates to ensure that voting was safe and healthy for our communities. It was in the middle of the pandemic, right? So we turned out not only because we realized how important it is to vote, but because a lot of the issues that we as young people care about were on the table of discussion, right? So like we turned out because of climate change. We turned out because we didn't want to see any more police brutality. We turned out because we needed something to get done around gun violence prevention. So we really turned out in such big numbers across the country. And that was really exciting to see. So young people are a force to sort of be reckoned with, or not reckoned with, actually supported and lifted up.
Okay. Now, I mentioned in my most recent Hill column that for the first time, there were that in every recent presidential election we've had, baby boomers and members of the silent generation were the largest group in the presidential electorate. In 2020, for the first time, there were more of the younger group, including millennials and Generation X and Generation Y in the electorate than the older members. What impact do you think this is going to have on American politics, Edwith?
I'm excited to see. I think right now, post the election, folks have gotten settled in. We've seen a lot of policy solutions come to the forefront. And we basically are like, we turned out to vote. We want to see the things that we voted for happen. So I feel like there's a new relationship that is building between young people and our democracy. And there's going to be a new sense of accountability. We've seen under the Trump administration, young people came out and protested and took to the streets. And now we are under, I guess, a friendlier, better administration. So the partnership and the relationship is going to look different. So I'm excited to see how young people continue to be centered in these important conversations. Like even as we talk about reconciliation and like different government packages and like what does it mean to make an economy work for all of us? Like I think the experiences of millennials, of Gen Z should definitely be at the forefront of that.
Mark, do you think millennials will turn out in the midterm elections in 2022? Because traditionally older voters are, good, solid voters in midterm elections. Younger people, not so much.
I think the trends look good for that being the case for an increased turnout in the midterm elections. You also have issues that are on the table right now that are engaging young Americans, like student loan debt, canceling student loan debt, climate change, and also having a more just America for people of all different races and genders. So I think that younger groups, and just to say to Edwith, don't feel, I was born in 1982, so I don't even know if I'm like allowed to be included. And I call myself a millennial, but I'm like right at the tip, So, but no, I do feel, I think it's also empowering, Brad, to hear those numbers that Edwith cited, and to see once you have that power as a voter, as a voting group, you don't want to give it up. You don't want to cede it. So I think that it just drives people to get even more involved for the midterms. Obviously, we'll have to see what the numbers look like, but I think it's very encouraging to see how people came out in such large numbers during a pandemic. So, people have been able to get vaccinated, hopefully have a safer situation to vote coming up in the midterm elections. So I think that there's encouraging signs that we will continue to see an increase in voter turnout for younger generations.
Okay,
Can I also wait? When we get back.
We're going to have to break now. We come back with more at Deadline DC. We're going to talk about student debt and millennials and Generation X and Generation Y with the provocative progressive political panel. You think after all this time you'll learn how to say that correctly? We'll be back right after these messages.
What I know about courage, I learned from my adoptive mom. She said sometimes you just gotta hold on.
All right, you are clear for live stream only, Brad.
Okay, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Our guests today on the Provocative Progressive Political Panel are Edwith Theogene, Advocacy Director of Generation Progress, and our own executive producer and political activist, Mark Grimaldi. Edwith, I cut you off when we were going to break, so please resume.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Mark was saying about young people turning out to vote. I think we will continue to turn out to vote, but since we had this really great election where the national standard for voting was actually lifted up in terms of expanding access to voting, we've also seen a response within state houses and legislators across the country of voter suppression bills. Passing in record numbers, being introduced, enacted. I think right now we have like about 400, if not over that, of voter suppression bills in response. So it's really going to be hard to tell what's going to happen in the midterm election if now they're making it harder and not easier for people to vote. So I think people might be will be like taking to the streets and turning out to vote, but there's a more likelihood that their votes will be like thrown out, that they'll be purged from voter logs, that none of their information will be there, or they won't have the support and resources and tools that they need to actually vote. So, I mean, it just calls for the government to really take action around this. So we already have 2 federal policy solutions that I've already jabbered on the show multiple times, the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which are just some of the policy solutions that I think Congress needs to take action on to remedy the fact that we have such an uptick in voter suppression.
Okay. Let's move on and talk about a different, you know what, I'm going to, let's move and talk. One thing I'd like to talk about, and Mark, maybe you can address this since you have 2 young children. The United States government has begun sending child care tax payments to parents of young children. One Democratic United States Senator, I think it was Cory Booker of New Jersey, said this is one of the most significant poverty-fighting actions that the United States government has undertaken in its history. You want to comment on the child care tax credit, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely well overdue and very powerful. You know, coincidentally, my wife and I actually just received our first child tax credit check for our 2 young daughters who are 4 and 6 years old. And that money goes directly to stimulate the economy. I know we're going to be using the money for things like they're buying their school supplies, buying clothes for them. I know for a lot of people, it's going to go to buy food. It's projected that this is part of a larger package within the COVID relief bill will cut child poverty rates in half, which just think about how empowering that is for a family who, you know, thank God, you know, that's not something that I'm currently facing or my children are. However, there's many families who are, and to be able to feed your children, I mean, think about how terrible that would feel not to be able to do that, and then to have something like this change that. It's hard to think of something more empowering than that and important than that when you really put it on a grand scale of other policies.
Okay.
I know we're coming back now, so I'm going to stop
Okay,
talking.
we're going to break now, and we're going to bring back our radio listeners with more of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Okay, welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. Today, our guests on the Provocative Progressive Political Panel are our own executive producer and political activist, Mark Grimaldi, and Edwith Theogene, who is Director of Advocacy at Generation Progress. Edwith, I'm going to ask you to talk about one of the issues that Generation Progress is very active in, and that is the dealing with the overwhelming burden that many millennials and Generation X and Z folks have paying off their student loans. Are we going to get a significant movement from the Biden administration to deal with the student loan debt?
I hope so. I mean, it seems like a ping pong game right now where the Biden administration was considering and thinking about what actions that they could take, and then they passed it over to Congress, and Congress has debated a couple of different ideas right now. And the urgency of it is just like really, really getting high because the pause in student loan repayments are set to end sometime in September. So a resolution, I hope, can happen very soon. So I honestly don't know. Is it going to be Biden that's going to be delivering the solution to this, or is it going to be Congress? We know that this is definitely an urgent and important matter to young people. Even just the pause within this moment during the pandemic has been helpful. A lot of people have been able to get a certain kind of financial security that they've never had within their home life. They've been able to put money back into the economy. They've been able, a lot of the things that we heard in that clip that Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, was discussing about how the student debt crisis is holding people back, you know, and the majority of people, like when you look at the data and the information of who is most impacted by the student debt crisis, there are folks who haven't even finished getting their degrees. There are people who've been impacted by predatory loans. There are people that have low paying jobs. And, you know, you can contextualize that with the gender wage gap, the racial wage gap. There's just like so many different things. So it's clearly really important and urgent that we do something about it.
You know, Mark, you said one thing about the child tax credit that I think probably also applies to student loans. It puts money back in the economy. And it seems to me that's one thing that the child tax credit payments do is you're going to use it to purchase school supplies. And also it seems to me that many younger people have delayed making purchases, like for homes, for example, because they're so burdened with student loans to pay off.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's studies showing, and I know Edwith is more of an expert on this than I am, but I've read incredible statistics about it outpacing people's rent payments as their number one bill each month. I mean, just think about how expensive that is for a family. Yet, you know, we're told without college, you're not going to get a good job. You're not going to have a good future. So it's this catch-22 situation that once you do, you know, what you've been told your whole young life as you've been educated is, you know, go to college. And once you do that and you start getting, you know, a job, you see, like Edwith talked about also, for women, there's that wage gap. So they're making even less money to pay back these loans. So I think, you know, canceling student loan debt, that number that Senator Warren brought up, $50,000, I think would stimulate the economy in ways that few other things could, especially with it, you know, potentially with the president being able to sign off on it and avoid having to go through Congress. I think would be extremely powerful, and it would be something that would be incredible if he did it. So I'm really hoping that he does. I'm hoping that he listens to the people who voted for him, which, as we've talked about, are many young people. And I think you would also see that money, Brad, like you said, go into the economy at a time when it's sorely needed. You know, the stock market is not a direct correlation to the economy at all times, but, you know, just today we've seen almost 800 points lost in the Dow Jones for fear of inflation. There would be a great time to inject the economy with a shot in the arm, like canceling the student loan debt. And I think, you know, it would help a lot of young families.
And although this isn't the topic of the show, and we will talk about this soon, I hope, the other reason for the stock market losses today was, besides inflation, was the concern about the rising level of the coronavirus, especially the Delta variant. So, but I'm sure we're going to talk about that soon. Edwith, let me ask you about something else. Last week, the the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, announced that Democrats had tentatively, and I use the word tentatively, agreed on a spending package of $3.5 trillion over 10 years for infrastructure. Now, in addition to the usual things you think of, infrastructure, roads, bridges, transit systems, it also includes expanding Medicare for dental and eye vision coverage, and a number of other things. I'm not quite sure they've worked out the details. There actually may be a vote on it, but this is a package that Democrats can only pass if all 50 Democratic senators agree on it with the help of Vice President Harris and pass it through reconciliation. It struck me, if they can work out the details, this is very significant. What's your view of it, Edwith?
I think it is really significant. I think I'm happy to see that in this infrastructure package, they've also applied a climate justice lens to it to try to figure out how they can do more around that. But there's always more money that you can invest, in making the world better and helping to address the climate crisis. So that was something that I saw that was good. I am sort of waiting to see if they can actually pass this and get all 50 Democrats on it. I'm curious about what negotiations are going to be made, because I think there's also this race to try to get this passed by August recess, which is very soon. And I think there's also a resolution or some other things that are coming to the floor as well. So I'm, sitting in bated breath, waiting to see what happens.
Yeah, we may know later this week what happens. And I think one of the hangups, from what I can see, is actually on climate change. Senator Manchin from West Virginia, which is, he's a protector of fossil fuels. I read that last week he made a comment that he thinks, and he's maybe right about this, that the package is a danger to the fossil fuel industry. And of course, the problem is if they do anything to make it less protective, if they do anything to appease Senator Manchin, that may stop some progressive Democratic senators like Bernie Sanders from supporting the package. So I guess my question to you, Edwith, is do you think this thing's going to work out, and do you think it will end up addressing climate change? And we're having flooding in Western Europe. There are droughts and wildfires in the western United States. We've had record heat waves in the Arctic. There's very little good news on the climate change front these days. Do you think we're going to get something significant that Senator Sanders and Senator Manchin will work out of their differences and we'll get this big package?
I hope so. I mean, you talked about the record heat wave, and I've been hit by that. I also have family I'm from Florida. I can't boast amazing senators like you can, Brad, from Massachusetts. But, even the fear and the scare of hurricane season and the fact that a lot of communities don't have the resources to be resilient in the face of this. So I'm hoping that progressives don't back down, but it seems like everyone keeps pandering to Manchin and giving him all this power. And I'm like, stop it. Why? So I'm just hoping, I hope that an agreement can be met, but in that agreement, progressives don't lose ground from what is important for the people.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I don't know what's going to be in the final package any more than anything else does. But if this thing passes, it strikes me as very significant because it's a big investment, $3.5 trillion over 10 years for dealing with some of the biggest problems facing our nation. That's it for Deadline DC today. I want to thank our guest, Colonel Cedric Leighton, U.S. Air Force retired. Edwith Theogene, who is Director of Advocacy at Generation Progress, and our own executive producer, Mark Grimaldi. Don't despair. We'll be back next Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can watch the podcast anytime on periscope.tv/Brad Bannon.